It is, as you guys can imagine, my privilege to have Jacqueline Novogratz, who's not only the founder of Acumen, but my boss, and has been for 16 years, so I will try not to grill her too much. But I am going to start with you, because in some ways, so much of the conversation that we're having now is about social enterprise and what that means. So I wanted to ask you to start and just talk a little bit about why you started Acumen, why you focus on social enterprise, what it means to you.
In 1 minute.
2, you can take 2.
Thanks, Yasmina. Thanks for this whole day. Thanks, Zahid, as well. Both of your comments were really beautiful, and I do think this is the moment for these kinds of partnerships. I want to pick up where you were talking about before. Social enterprise, when we started Acumen, still the same, but this idea that there are individuals in the world who are entrepreneurs, and yet they're driven to solve a problem using the tools of business as the means, staying maniacally focused on the end of solving the problem. And you talked about the early days of being humiliated at times. And it reminded me of 2007, which was a big year for Acumen, when we focused on 2 crazy social entrepreneurs, a guy named Shafi Mathur, who was starting an ambulance company in India when 90% of people in ambulances were dead. And he had 9 ambulances. And then these other 2 guys that had a solar light to eradicate kerosene for 1.5 billion people. And I have this distinct moment of being at Aspen Ideas Festival. And I was so excited to present this social enterprise of these 9 ambulances that were going to transform ambulances. And this very prominent Indian businessman, there were about 300 people there, said, I love your enthusiasm, but do you know how many people live in Bombay? And I was like, yeah, 17 million. And he said, 9 ambulances? That's the problem with social enterprise. You people are too smart, you're too marginal, and you think you have the solutions. And it was such a humiliating moment, and he was so prominent that I could feel the whole audience look at him like, And I was just standing there with this feeling of being crushed, and I said, well, nothing else is working. We might as well try something. And that company today, really by having what all of the social entrepreneurs in this room have, this vision, but also this resiliency, this grit, and importantly, the ability to partner. Now has 13,000 employees, 3,500 ambulances, and serves about 4 million people in the world. By going in and daring and having the guts to continue to dare, not only does Zikitsa serve millions of people, but it has become the standard for policies for emergency services across India and now other countries in the world. That is the promise of social enterprise. And that's why we need different kinds of capital. That's why we need to bring the kind of humanity Zahid spoke about so beautifully into the way we partner. And that's why I am an unapologetic and a highly committed believer to not only social entrepreneurs, but at some point, I hope we can get rid of the word social, and that the whole purpose of business becomes the way we solve problems for each other on this fragile planet.
Thank you. Well, I think I just want to acknowledge that on this panel we have, I think, representatives of not only kind of the new guard and new models of business, but Jeff, I want to turn to you as someone who is in an old guard, a company that's been around for a long time, that has always had values embedded within it, but is now turning to looking at the world more broadly and taking responsibility for more of what's going on throughout the value chain. So I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on, how do you see Hershey fitting into the world in this kind of new age of what business can mean, some of the goals that Hershey has, and how do you think social enterprise fits into that?
Okay, I'm not sure how to take old guard, but
the startup Hershey.
We'll roll with this from there. How about that? So if you think, from a cocoa standpoint, from the business end, right? It's about go source cocoa today, tomorrow, and keep cocoa flowing. go do that. On the sustainability end, I mean, the issues are well known and it's long. We're dealing with deforestation, farmer livelihoods, community development, youth opportunities or the lack thereof. So we go and you start to bring in someone who has done farmer development in another country, a large development organization, you bring that in and you plug it into the problem. And you do that for all of these various issues. You're bringing in things from outside, typically of cocoa, that have worked other places and plugging them in, which works. You're supporting farmers, which is a great thing to do. But we're starting to take a step back and say, you know, instead of that bringing the outside in, why don't we start thinking from an inside out? Because what are we really trying to do is create opportunity in the country. So if we start to look at the idea of local entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs, they start to look at a problem and start to fix the problem. And if we're talking about the same issues, that's fantastic. But they start to do it in a much more, I think, sustainable way. Because they look at this through the lens of that any entrepreneur would, and it's about incrementalism, right? I have more ideas. I want to come up with new products, new services, new ways of going about things. And that starts to lead to then developing economic opportunity, more jobs. So we're starting now then to build the infrastructure of the countries that we're trying to impact instead of just bringing in things from outside. So we're trying to look at this inside-out development, and we really think that's then going to start to stimulate the economies of these countries, along with helping cocoa farmers at the same time. We think that's the long-term sustainable way to start making long-term impact.
That's great. And we'll get into what that looks like, the nitty-gritty bit. But I wanted to hear from some of the entrepreneurs that have joined us. First, Carlos, I think for you, in some ways, you're building this kind of disruptive business model, reimagining what cocoa can look like as an industry. And I'll mention that we actually have a whole panel dedicated to that topic because I think it's important to hear from the entrepreneurs that are actually rethinking, reimagining what it could look like to source and produce chocolate. But I think to bring that perspective, you know, what is different about the way that you created your business, and what motivates you to build a different kind of chocolate company?
Well, thank you, Yasmina, for putting this together. I think it's a great day and a great opportunity to share with so many companies, large and small, and challenge today a little bit the status quo and have this great debate for the good of so many people. And I think building on what Jacqueline said about calling us a social enterprise versus innovation, I read one day someone calling it the business model for the future, or the new business model for the future. And I think that business model of the future, instead of just looking after the shareholders' value, looks at how you can really distribute in a more evenly manner the profits that are created throughout the chain. And I think that for us as a enterprise translates into having the development or the improvement of the livelihoods or the cocoa growers we work with, the good, is as important to us as to finding the right customers. Is integrated with our business model. It's not something that we do because we want, but without it happening, our business model just wouldn't be successful. And I think that's the power of it. As some of you may know, the Colombian industry for cacao has been dominated by two very large buyers, as is the case for the industry in many places, that haven't had a focus in quality. And we didn't take advantage of developing some of the best cacaos in the world, so farmers were not really receiving a special price, a high price or a stable price for a specialty crop, but a volatile price for a commodity, as commodities are marked most around the world. So we saw an opportunity there, and we addressed it by providing growers with infrastructure needed to develop specialty cacaos, giving them the necessary training to improve the quality of their crops, and offering them a stable, high price so they could concentrate on the farms, invest in the farms because they knew in advance how much we were going to pay for the crops, and this is something they never had before. with the Acumen, we're an Acumen investee, and Acumen did a lean data analysis to measure the impact that our work is having in the supply chain. And we found two very interesting things. One is that this stable price is some of the things producers value the most. And the other thing is that producers that were working with us were receiving a incremental income between 58 to 75%, which I think is pretty good.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you. So we have a sort of a disruptor, and then we have another business model. And Hugh, I'd love for you to describe a little bit about what that model is, but where we actually saw a potential opportunity to have a social enterprise really working alongside the industry. And I think that's something that we also see as really huge potential to both challenge the status quo, but also to help deepen the effectiveness of these efforts to make impact for communities. So tell us about PEG Africa. What is this company all about?
Great. So PEG is focused on West Africa. We've got about 1,000 staff, 400 are full-time, 600 are commission-based sales agents, literally walking along dusty roads, knocking on doors of poor, underserved households. We've raised about $50 million in the last 4 years.
Wow.
And we're focused on financing useful and productive solar products to underserved consumers. If I could wind back a bit, and where we started was when I first traveled in Africa, I got so frustrated by the fact people kept saying, you know, we don't serve those customers. They're too poor. They're too remote, and that was very frustrating for me because you know, these customers, they have income. It's very seasonal. That's one of the big challenges. They're very exposed to shocks such as healthcare or you know, emergencies they don't plan for, but they have income. It's just that we can't plan it. They don't have a paycheck every month. So the big challenge we wanted to tackle was, how do we finance useful, productive assets to these customers, like solar home systems, which save them money over a long period of time, because currently they're spending a lot on kerosene, candles, batteries. How do we finance these products to them in a way that you know, works with their income streams? So in Ghana, for example, in Ivory Coast, where we've got most of our operations, we finance solar home systems. So the solar panel is about this big. It powers lights, phone charger, radio, torch, TV, and a fan. So these are super energy efficient appliances. Your kettle would use 50 times more energy than our system produces, yet we power all these appliances. And we provide financing over 3 years to these customers who have no paycheck, no assets. They're semi-literate or illiterate generally. They are not bankable, you know, as far as the financial system is concerned. We've figured out how to give financing to these customers in a way that they can get access to these assets that actually save them a lot of money over a long period of time. Because right now they're spending so much on kerosene, candles, and batteries, and they're doing it in perpetuity. With our products, they can pay a little bit every day. They get access to this cleaner, brighter, better energy system, and they'll own it eventually. And once they own it, they've got access to free energy, and then they free up that spend, that energy spend, to focus on things like education, healthcare, and so on. We also have started branching into other products, such as solar water irrigation. So we know that farmers, smallholder farmers, spend a lot of money on diesel-powered irrigation systems. They can only afford a certain number of days per year. It affects their crop yield, etc. We have figured out how to finance these products to these customers again in a way that they can own it over 18 months. The payback on all our systems is generally 12 to 24 months. It's a very fast payback for these customers, often the best investment they'll ever make. And we're about giving asset ownership to customers who have no other options. And we believe that if we can show that that business model can work, that we can bring in competition, we would love more competition in our markets, because we can show these customers can pay, they have the ability to pay, and they deserve to be treated like customers. Because competition, we believe, can bring in more choices, can increase quality, drive down prices to the end consumer, and make the quality of life for our customers better. So we're West Africa focused. We have big ambitions to reach millions of people. We're definitely not there yet. A lot of our customers are cocoa farmers, and we're very excited to be here.
Great, thank you. So I think we see the potential, we see this kind of convergence that we were talking about earlier, that there are needs, that there's pieces of the puzzle, but then how do we bring them together? So I was going to come back to you, Jacqueline, in terms of what you've seen, what you've learned. How do you see corporations and social enterprises doing more together?
I think that in some ways Zaid really did a beautiful job of talking about the arc. That I would say in the early days it was often a question of when it hasn't worked, what can you do for me? And there was a loss of the humanity of what are we doing together. And you're seeing a huge shift. Some of the best we want to be part of solving this problem. We want to learn about these markets. We want to change who we are. And when I think about some of the most successful partnerships, both with Acumen and then what I've seen with our companies, you talked about EY, who have done such a wonderful job of working inside individual companies. I see Vicky Tam up there from Bain, and I was talking about her behind her back the other day because talking to her boss, that what she has done, and I think what you talked about, Zaid, this is a human relationship. What she has done is joined Acumen in a way, as we have joined Bain. And so there's a confluence of values, there's a confluence of focus on what we're trying to do in the world, and therefore there's a deep vulnerability around what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. Both in terms of what we're learning, which is easier to talk about, and how we may not be behaving in ways that are conducive to real success. It's that kind of relationship that, again, focuses on what are we trying to do together and what's getting in our way from doing it. When I look at our companies and where they've really partnered, it's a very similar dynamic where D-Light, which has now brought light to 90 million people, where you started to see spikes is when Total came in and said, we've got these gas stations across Africa. We could use the distribution platform to do that. In the chocolate industry, going down with Uncommon Cacao, with Dandelion, a local chocolate company out of San Francisco, to create relationships together as the buyer and the producer, to know that they were looking for the same kinds of chocolate qualities, building relationships. And so I really do think I loved your inside out. It's being super clear about what you are getting out of the relationship, not hiding from that, what you are bringing to the relationship and what your commitment is to it. And then the only thing I would add would be, particularly with corporations, is make sure you have relationships at different levels. I will often know a CEO, and then you will know their head of procurement and sustainability, so that when things change, and things sometimes change, you have different people that will be your allies.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear your experience in that same narrative of working
on
with
the other
social
side.
enterprises. The other side, not the old guard, but I mean, in some ways, people have these preconceptions about both social enterprises and about corporations. And I think sometimes people imagine that corporations have magic wands and they have big rooms full of resources that they're just waiting to deploy. And the reality is it's actually really much more difficult than that. So I wanted to hear more about kind of the early work that you've done at Hershey to actually engage with local enterprises, kind of, if you can, the highs and the lows of that work.
So, same project, two different stories. So we had developed a product called CocoaLink, which was a way of giving farmers access to information, training, weather, and it was first done through SMS technology. And this was 4 years ago. So we developed it, worked on it, implemented, tested, proved that yields went up, people were happy. And with, at the time, good development projects, you should then pass that off. And the line of sight was we passed it off then to the government to be able to then implement for cocoa farmers across the country. And everyone felt great. Come back 3 years later and it hadn't moved. It just got lost. So I think we're now looking at this through a different lens, which is now how do you make this long-term successful? So we're now working with a local entrepreneur. We've brought it to smartphone technology. So now you can have video training, and that came from when you would go to training, sometimes you would see people in the fields taping the thing that we're doing on pruning for the day so they can watch and reference it later. We're looking at gamification. We think that now this platform has big opportunity. But the best piece is this is now going to be a business. This is going to be run by that entrepreneur. And we're working with them and keep providing them capital so they can refine that model. And then it's the conversation we were having, which is it's not just our farmers. There's a whole lot of other folks operating in this area, and you need these economies of scale. So we've talked about absolutely you should be selling to the Mars and the Mondelez and the Nestles of the world because we need that scale. And that's a good thing for this entrepreneur because now then we know when we move on in the quote unquote from our perspective, the job is done, this thing keeps running.
Yeah.
And that's really how we need to start thinking about these things from a development standpoint. What's the underlying model? And it tends to be just, a business model. Everyone now has skin in the game, and it just keeps, that flywheel keeps going.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when people think about social enterprise, maybe because there's been so much discussion about the kind of capital that these companies need, a lot of folks assume that if they're not an investor, then there's not much they can do. But I think what I hear from most of the entrepreneurs that I've talked to about this is they're usually capitalized, and what they're looking for is partnership. Mm-hmm. They want new customers, they want people to help them access customers, they want access to technology, to insights, and so there are so many different ways of kind of creating that added value. But as I'm sure you've also experienced, it's not always the case that the business is ready to partner or has exactly what it needs. Have you had any experiences where it wasn't quite what you were hoping?
It's never on the time frame you want. I mean, ideally you want to come in, even with the projects talked about. We want to come in and in 12 months we want to be done and we want to move on. That's sort of how our cycle works. And that's just not reality. You need that healthy dose of patience, which is, okay, now I see where you are after 12 months. Now how do we get to this next stage? And I'm with you. You may start to think, and how we've talked about it is you sometimes have to think like almost like a VC investor, which is, all right, I'm with you up here and we're so far. I'm still with you, but now my investment's here because you should have covered this much ground. And I'm going to start signaling to you strongly that I'm going to start backing away. And that, I think, helps drive that sense of urgency on the other end. Because in those timelines, I think they have to meet in the middle. Yeah. But I think the corporates always want to move faster than I think the entrepreneurs sometimes can. That's just the nature of the large organization versus this person who's just trying to get off the ground.
Yeah. Well, and it also speaks to this idea that to make a successful partnership, there might need to be other actors at the table to help address some of those gaps. Hopefully Acumen can be one, but I think there's a lot of groups in this room that are really committed to social enterprise development, and supporting those kinds of relationships, I think, is a huge area of opportunity. So Hugh, for you, as you're thinking about scaling your business and really taking over all of Africa with this incredible model, what are the kinds of partnerships that you're looking for with corporates?
Yeah, you said in your remarks, fanning the flames, and I think that's a really good analogy. We're a little fire with some kindling, and we want to put some big chunks of wood on it, and that's what partnerships do for us. We're a business built on partnerships. I'll give you two examples. So Jacqueline mentioned Total. So Total is an investor, and we also partner with their local operations to do distribution, to do some sales, etc. Partnering with Total helps with brand recognition and certainly helps us get the market. That was also, Jacqueline, you mentioned having relationships at various levels. You need lots of relationships at all of the levels. The HQ could love the idea, but the people on the ground hate it. And so you need to really invest in those relationships quite heavily. So Total's been a good one for us. Another example is hospitalization insurance. So we had a problem 3 years ago that we identified, our customers were so susceptible to external health shocks that when something happened, they would stop repaying the loan that we would give them, and we wouldn't hear from them for months. And we were researching, and we realized that this healthcare was the issue, and we realized we could do something about it. And we partnered with Prudential and Bima, so Prudential being the underwriter, and Bima being the insurance provider. And we developed a bespoke health insurance product for our customers that we give them for free, and it basically insures them against unexpected healthcare issues. It also covers things like childbirth now, and it covers an extra member of the household. And our repayment rates went up when we started giving this out for free, and it's because customers valued it, number one, but two, they were no longer susceptible to these unexpected healthcare events that would wipe out their savings for months. So I think that's a great example of how you can use these partnerships to actually improve business outcomes and do a lot of good, I think.
Yeah, well, and presumably you're a customer of this partnership, right? So
yeah,
you're paying them, but it's something that creates mutual value for you and for them. And Carlos, I wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about your experience with one particular partnership, because I think it gives a sense of the impact that partnerships can have with Crepes and Waffles, and kind of how that happened and what it's meant for your business.
Okay, so in our case, partnerships are really relevant at that level right now. When we partnered up with companies that are like-minded, that have a similar vision in terms of what sustainability and development for the sector means, that have a deep focus also in quality, and that are willing also to pay that price at a stable rate that allow us to offer that service to the producers we work with of a stable price, as I mentioned before. So Crepes and Waffles is one, or I would say the major food restaurant chain in Colombia. They offer a product that is very high quality, but affordable for many people. So they reach a middle class in Colombia. That's the kind of place where when you're traveling, you wish you had in other places. It's a perfect combination of quality and a good price.
We'll have to open one in Oxford.
Yeah, I'll go there.
And
I think they want you to use the mic.
Okay. So Crepes and Waffles, and these relationships take long to build. I mean, these things don't happen overnight. The founder of Crepes and Waffles came to our new factory inauguration in September 2016, and only 2 years later, last fall, we launched with them an ice cream and a beverage using our Tumaco chocolate. They call it Dulce Tumaco, sweet Tumaco. Tumaco is an area in Colombia that is still highly affected by the conflict. Stasi, who's here from Uncommon, she's a great promoter of our Tumaco cocoa beans in the US. Dandelion, who you just mentioned, buys them and has a chocolate bar. And it's a region where most Colombians wouldn't dare to visit. That if you open up the news about Tumaco, you will just read difficult things. You introduced me to Michelle yesterday, and we were speaking about how displacement takes place still in that kind of places, that because there is an ongoing conflict. So these producers are cacao producers are being affected by all of this. So the work we're doing there is clearly having a very positive impact on creating sustainable ways of income in a region that really needs them. And if we didn't have that kind of partnerships like Crepes and Waffles, first we couldn't back the purchase from the producers, but also we couldn't tell the good story that is also so important, that brings up the pride and the motivation for producers in that region, because they now realize that they're really producing some of the best cacaos in the world, that their name is out there in a really positive and good way. So I think the importance of partnerships, and I really would like also this opportunity today for the large and small companies here in the audience that buy cacao to consider this new way of doing business and buying cacao. We were just talking with Jeff right before we started, and the power a large company like Hershey's could have in the industry if a new model of addressing the challenge of prices for the producers could be considered. So thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully many new partnerships will be on the making by the end of the day.
That is our hope.
Can I just add
please.
because what Carlos, just bridging what Carlos said and Jeff said, it reminded me of being ready to partner also for the social enterprise and the corporation. We tried to cultivate a major corporation for a number of years, Yasmina, both you and me, for 7 years. And I remember finally where we were like, all right, it's do or die conversation. And we sat and the senior officer on the other side of the table said to me, you know, at the beginning, Acumen wasn't ready for us, and we weren't ready for you. And that level of honesty was actually really liberating, because when we finally decided to partner, we were super ready for each other. And then we could get stuff done. And so I think that there's, I think that this idea of knowing who you are and what you offer, as well as what you can give, enables those partnerships to be more effective.
Yeah. Well, there's something else in the story about Tumaco, this community that, again, is associated with violence and disruption, that now you have this product that says Sweet Tumaco, and what that means for the consumers, for the company that has put that brand out there, and for the community to feel like they're offering something to the world that is known as sweet and known as precious. And I think because we talk a lot about scale, you know, that's often the thing that gets in the way. We can't work with you because it's too small scale. And I don't think that issue is going to go away, but I feel like when we start to talk about social enterprise and kind of rethinking business, we also have to look at scale differently, because ideas sometimes start small but have these ripple effects. They have this transformative effect. And I think it can be hard to know, you know, what it would mean for one company in Colombia to use your chocolate in 2 products, and what that has meant for the communities that are producing that cocoa. So it's something to think about, because I think it becomes a barrier often that if it's not big, then it doesn't work, versus, well, how big does it need to be to create that ripple effect and to start the right shift? So I mean, I think what I want to do in a second is open this up and start to hear from folks in the audience what questions they have for you or their own thoughts on the matter. But before I do, I just sort of, as you had said, you had kind of some pearls of wisdom. But if Carlos, you or Jeff or Hugh, and maybe we'll start with you, Hugh, can share just a little piece of advice for either a social enterprise in the audience or for a corporation to think about as they're embarking on this journey to partner with social enterprise. What advice would you give?
Yeah, I think partnerships are the lifeblood of how we make these broken ecosystems or these unformed ecosystems work. I think if you try to do it all yourself, you're doomed to spend your decades and decades getting to where you would get to if you otherwise partnered. You would get there twice as quick. We're really built on partnerships as a business, and I think it allows us to focus. And so figure out what you're great at and try to partner with everything else. I think the point about spending a lot of time on building relationships is a great one. These things don't happen overnight. They take a lot of time, and build those relationships at various levels, because you'll need everyone.
Yeah. How about you, Jeff?
I'll try to go from each end. So I think from a company perspective, when we opened up, and one of the words that came out was ego. And I think from a company perspective, it's leave your ego at the door. Recognize you don't have all the answers, and at least recognize, or at least act like, you're not the smartest person in the room. And don't think you can come to the social entrepreneur and say, hey, I know you have a model, I need you to do this, and let me tell you, these are all the things that I know that you should do different. I think that is the advice I would give companies. On the other end, I think social entrepreneurs, come to the company and some point, recognize the value you bring, which you do, but then come and say, this is the problem I'm helping you solve. And it might not necessarily be the product that you're, or the service that you're selling, but it's the I'm helping you reach, for instance, in cocoa, the rural poor and bring electrification. And then these are all the other things that are going to come along for it. Like healthcare is another issue that we contend with. There's lots of things that you can help solve. Or I'm also going to help bring infrastructure. And oh, by the way, you were talking about thousands of people now selling in the rural market. Those could be the youth in your cocoa area that we could provide training and then give them employment and things of that nature. So talk that language, because then I think the companies are going to say, aha, now I know how to plug you in. Because sometimes we miss it. We sort of miss the bigger picture on where exactly you could fit in all the things that you could do.
Yeah. Anything you want to add?
Yes, you mentioned scaled as being one of these mental constraints somehow for partnerships between a large corporation and a small social enterprise or new business enterprise to happen. But I think the most relevant thing besides scale is that the relationship adds value to both ends, hopefully as much.
Yeah.
So when you look at the crepes and waffles, they could have bought chocolate from anywhere else and from any other buyer, probably at a much better price for them. But what we brought on the table for them was also the possibility to not only impact the region they were wanting to impact, but also to tell a good story that for them brought value. So even a small company like us can add value to a large company like them. And I think this makes that partnership valuable and sustainable. And that's why it's so important to look from the small corporation that other company has a similar way of looking at a business model. And I think from the other end, it's important that the larger corporations or whoever in that team is approaching with the smaller corporation has the possibility of making things happen, or has the backing with the organization to make things happen. Usually these relationships take longer than expected. It's a long journey. Unexpected things happen along the way. So if there is not a strong backing within the organization, things could fail. In the case of the crepes and waffles relationship, we're dealing with the family that owns the company. So they were decision makers, and that really helped us to navigate through those 2 years and make things happen.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'm sure other folks have questions and their own advice, so I'm going to open it up. Laura, we can start with you, and Emily's got a mic she can pass around.
Thank you. This is really inspiring. Laura Koch, YPO and Dolium. And my question is very simple. You really devote yourself about partnerships. The SDGs is about not leaving anybody behind, and the golden rule. And number 17 is the most important thing. That's something that most people are suddenly realizing. And you talked about NGOs and private companies. Now, my question is, what about the possibility of for-profit companies and for-profit companies partnering with NGOs so that they really scale the situation? Have you had that type of connections? Especially like look into issues like deforestation or insurance, because I think that is the future of real scale, where there's multiple partnerships, including the government too.
Thank you. I'm looking at Jeff because he was very kind, and a few months ago he let me shadow him on a trip to Ghana, and it was the launch of a very unique partnership. So I'm wondering if you can share.
Sure. So I think you're right. And it's not just a large company and a social entrepreneur coming together. We like to talk about from a cocoa perspective. I mean, this is not the issues that I opened up with are not going to get solved by one group alone or two groups alone. It's the two groups, and it's governments, and it's NGOs, and it's regional, the origin governments all coming together and doing their part. So we've been, one of the things that we just did that Yasmina joined us on, we were launching a project adopting Cacao National Park, which is a large park in Ghana, and working on deforestation and agroforestry. And honestly, how can those farmers on the periphery of the forest coexist with the forest? And we've partnered with NGOs, both from Ghana and from abroad, to come together to pull that program together. And everyone has their role within that. So I do think that it is the right thing to do for these multiple parties to come together, because we all bring certain things to the table.
Yeah, and there's just one example that's not related to cocoa, but we worked with a company in northern Uganda that was producing cotton. And as they were working with kind of increasingly large numbers of returning displaced people who were learning how to do agriculture and getting into their supply chain, they found that they had a huge challenge, particularly with the women farmers, because of this really widespread issue of domestic abuse. And they kind of didn't know what the cause was, but as they started to understand and talk to people and dig into the issue, they found that it was having a big impact on the ability of women to participate. And they said, this isn't something that we know how to solve. This is not our expertise. We know how to help farmers to grow sunflower seeds and chilies and cotton and bring it to a global market. But they reached out to a local NGO and said, we need to work with you because this is the issue that is most deeply affecting this community. And I always draw inspiration from that because, again, it's knowing your strengths and knowing when to reach out and say, we need help to really address these systemic issues. Other questions? Right over here. Can you also say your name as Laura did so we know where you're coming from?
Yeah, thank you. Inspiring. A question for Hugh.
Can you just let us know where you're from?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Paul Chatterton from WWF, right. The Landscape Finance Lab. I'm particularly interested in what you were saying about microfinance to some of your customers and the insurance package. That's remarkable, and I think that's provides the potential for really scaling very small transactions across a very large area. My question is, what difficulties did you have in getting that happening? I'm sure there weren't a few. And what lessons would you have for the rest of us in working with the banking and finance and insurance industry at micro scale?
Yeah. So 50% of our customers earn less than $3 a day. So we really do reach very poor, very remote customers. I've been doing this for 10 years, and for the first 3 or 4, I was in the wilderness trying to figure out how to make this work. I've always been focused on trying to figure out how to finance these useful, productive assets to poor, underserved households. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way. In the first 3 years, I didn't pay myself anything. I had a young family. It was very stressful, but it's the purpose of, I know that this is a big thing we could be doing. I know that we will get there eventually, and we did. So I think the first lesson is stick at it, and you're going to face a lot of disappointments and a lot of challenges along the way. But if you've got that kind of shining star somewhere, you'll keep trudging through all the tough times. I think figuring out what we were going to focus on was key. So we work in markets where almost everything doesn't work. And so what are we going to be the best at? So we actually partner with D-Light, which is another Acumen of SD, to supply us with the products, the physical products that we sell, and to supply software systems that help us manage our operations so that we can focus on the financing aspect and on the last mile distribution aspect of it. And I suppose the last thing is, and Acumen has also been really helpful here, is hiring great people in the markets. And that's really hard to do because there's a lot of companies that are trying to hire the best people in these markets, and we were just a little company trying to figure things out. But because we'd been in the market for so long, because we knew enough people and we'd stuck at it, we managed to accumulate fantastic people, and now the business kind of is starting to run itself, and I can come here and talk about it. So I don't know if that's a silver bullet answer, but.
Thank you. Moving on up. Yeah, over there. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I'm Nina Schuler from the Department for International Development. And on the spirit of partnerships, what do you think would help and hinder sort of having development partners like to participate and engage in these types of partnerships? What can we do that helps partnerships? What can we do that potentially hinders these types of partnerships?
Well, I'll go. I mean, money always helps.
I'm glad you said it, not me.
Because the vast bank of resources, is, as Yasmina said, is really not there from a corporate perspective. But I think, honestly, I think folks who participate in lots of areas, I think your scope and what you see is so much broader than probably any of us up here. From the standpoint of, most of us, at least for me, it's cocoa, it's West Africa, is kind of what I'm here talking about today. That in the grand scheme of things, is a very narrow focus. So, and then as we start about, a social entrepreneur who's operating in West Africa is focusing on a particular issue and a product, right? It's even more narrow focus. So, as, what are the lessons then that you might learn to be able to say, hey, I've seen this over here. You may want to think about that. Or, hey, we have this partner over here or something. Can we bring in? How can we help? So I think that's another way to start just thinking about it. What are the things you've seen that we haven't? Or to your point, hey, we've seen these mistakes made. You may want to consider that. May always help as well.
I would just add that Jeff talked about the ecosystem, that we need everybody in the ecosystem. And one of the things we haven't really talked about is that some of the most courageous entrepreneurial individuals are in big institutions, corporations, and the large aid organizations. They actually need protection because they are going against a status quo, because I probably don't have to tell you this, but big institutions often operate in silos. And so aid gives grants to nonprofits, or they invest in for-profits, or they want to do things themselves. Those are like the three status quo things that really need shaping and changing. Within that are extraordinary individuals, if you can find them, that are willing to break the rules. And so, so many companies are dealing with talent issues. We've structured technical assistance as grants so that the companies can hire a consultant on the outside. And we've had so many conversations about what it would actually take to make the grant to the company or to somebody like Acumen, so that we can build in the kind of accompaniment that sometimes takes 10 to 12 years with these new companies, so that we can help them build. And those conversations often go nowhere until you find someone who's really willing to break the rules. And so I would say to have the humility, for us to have the humility of realizing that they're up against a lot, and then actually strategizing to how do we get the right kind of money to solve the problem. So that would be one big area on the technical assistance side, and being open to making grants into for-profit entities, not as sidecars. And then the other would be, rather than saying, I need this done, can I hire somebody to get that done? To actually start a conversation around what is the broad problem that we're trying to solve? Where are those individuals and or organizations that are trying to solve it, and how can we really creatively build the solutions? When you find it, like USAID for us in Latin America, essentially, again, it's money, but it was money through partnerships, understanding that if you are going to invest in companies like Cacao de Colombia, in post-conflict areas like Tumaco, we really need philanthropic capital to make these long-term investments. The representative for Colombia was creative, inspirational, risk-taking, and now proud. We've learned so much from him as he has learned from us, and unfortunately he just got transferred. And so it's, again, that same, you have to keep making the relationship piece.
Yeah. And one of the things that we've seen a lot is that there's this opportunity, I think, for, what happens after you do the work or make the investment. How do we convene the right players to co-create? How do we learn from this? I think both of you mentioned lean data as something that's helped you get a better understanding of the impact of your business. funding lean data is a thing, and we're trying to figure out how do we create the right resources, not only to bring capital, but beyond capital, to find the right data, to convene the right actors, and to support that process, which takes resources as well. So really great question, Nina, thank you. I want to go over to this side. Do we have any questions over here? I saw some hands earlier. Oh, there we go. You can just say your name and where you're from.
I'm Sako Warren, and I'm from Farmgate Cocoa Alliance. I think I have a question in regards to Mr. Hugh. My question is, you made a reference in Ghana where you try to work with partners, including governments. So my question I want to ask is, we're talking about cocoa. I want to specify on cocoa. So in cocoa, do you agree with me that one of the biggest problems we have in cocoa entrepreneurship based on farmers is as a result of the government not allowing the farmers to play their role? So if that is correct, so it is not about the issue of money, but it's about how do we make farmers become individual, independent entrepreneurs, so that when we want to carry our projects, instead of going to be working with governments, we deal with farmers, because farmers are the owners of the crops, not the governments. So I sit carefully listening every one statement, government and business, but these are the major problem. The major problem is the farmers are not playing their role as entrepreneurs. So I think the most important issue we should be talking is about the policy. How do you address it that the farmers can play their role directly with you, the industry? I think this is the point, and maybe you can explain that a little.
That's a very good and tough question. So we don't, as a social enterprise, we need to pick our battles, but we also don't feel like we're going to be driving policy in Ghana. I think where we see we can play a role is a lot of times we see cocoa farmers sitting on bags of cocoa they can't sell. It's effectively money in a bag, but it's not money until the government sets a price and it gets sold. And so what we're trying to figure out is how we can help the farmer turn that into something of value. So for example, could we finance a solar home system that would change their lives to them in return for cocoa bags, or in return for a pledge to give those cocoa bags to us when they turn them into cash, months before they have the cash. So we're trying to work within the system and within the constraints that exist. I agree that it's probably not a perfect setup, but the way we tend to operate is, hey, this is what's happening right now. How can we figure out how to make it better for the household? And our customers are the households, so we definitely operate at that level. Has Hershey gotten involved at all in conversations at the policy level?
I was trying to avoid that.
Yeah, I know. I could see that. I know you well enough.
It's a challenge. You're absolutely right from the standpoint of that prices are fixed by the government, and how do you handle that? So from an industry perspective, it is part of the conversation. As we've talked about, we were saying everyone has to come to the table to try to solve these issues, which means everyone has to bring something, and typically everyone has to give something. That's the conversation that I think we need to be having to try to solve from an ecosystem perspective. So.
Yeah, we were part of a debate that EY hosted on whether or not social enterprises are in some ways letting governments off the hook. I think a lot of social enterprises are essentially creating workarounds because of tremendous gaps that exist or flaws in policy and infrastructure. And it was a really interesting debate. I don't think we landed at sort of the answer, but I think it's just the reminder that social enterprise isn't going to fix what's broken in the world. It's an incredibly important part of the puzzle, but it isn't going to replace the changes in policy, changes in how these different groups work together that clearly has to happen as well. I want to take one more question. I think we're kind of at time, Christy, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, I'm Dr. Christy Leslie. I'm a researcher and writer on the cocoa industry. Most recently, my work has focused on the politics of the cocoa industry, which maybe will help frame my question. So we've talked a lot about partnerships, and I think the assumption behind partnerships is that there's a kind of level equalness between the different actors in the situation, what I have noticed is that we haven't really talked about power. And so everyone really in this room is in a position of power, and we're talking about really vulnerable populations. What I have noticed over the years is that sometimes powerful people can come in and say, this is the problem that I can fix. And therefore, the people will say, yes, that's my problem, right? And so then help me fix that, without really having an opportunity to express their own needs. And so if you can give me some examples of how you might have leveled some of those power differentials in the incredible work that you have all done over the years, have there been any moments that have stood out to you where you felt like those power differentials were, you were able to level them in some way and let the vulnerable people speak to their own truth and reality, rather than where perhaps money or resources were speaking for themselves?
Yeah. Carlos, do you have? I feel like this is something that in all your stories I hear this element of trying to create that greater balance.
Yes, and I think it's probably a very different level, but the type of communities we're working with have been, in many cases, the result of years of conflict in Colombia. So we're talking to populations like the Indian community, the Arhuacos Indian community. That's this chocolate that you can taste in the breakout session, in the chocolate break session. Sorry, there's not a coffee break session today. Or the Tumaco community, which are descendants from African slaves that escaped from the sugarcane plantation. So the trust over the years with the rest of the country has been lost. And what we've been trying to do, what we've been doing, is to create a relationship of equals. So it doesn't matter what your background is, what your level of education is. And the video that we saw yesterday with the Arhuacos, I think Hernan says it very well when he says, this is the first time we can talk about a price. This is not a middleman setting the price for our beans. It's us negotiating with the counterpart about this contract for buying the cacao. So at that level, you said the power at the same stage, and I think that's really important, that you can manage to create a scenario where everyone's equal in the room.
Yeah. Well, I think you've raised such an important question, and one that we probably can't bottom out in the time that we have. But I hope that we can take that into the rest of the day's conversations, because I think that's where we start to talk about systemic change, that it's not just, can we do a little better? Can we get some good outcomes? But what are we doing that changes this model? Because it's a fundamental challenge, and it's where I think this desire for disruption and this desire to really look at things differently is coming from, that the current structures aren't really working for everyone. So to keep that concept in our minds. I think I will have to wrap us up, but thank you all for sharing your experiences and your honest reflections, and thank all of you as well. I'm going to ask Emily to come up. I don't see her, but I think she might be behind the podium, to share just a couple of logistical announcements about the day, and then we will be gathering back in this room at the end of the day, so I look forward to seeing all of you then.